Hello, this is Virtualis the Chess Noob learning and having fun with chess. Sometimes in a game, there can almost be a karmic thematic symmetry. For instance, we've all had a game where we were on the verge of checkmating an opponent only to hang back rank mate. In the game I played earlier today, a positional blindness resulted in me losing my queen as the game crossed over from the opening to the mid-game. However, a thematic repetition on the part of the opponent as the game crossed from the mid-game towards the end game allowed me to clinch the victory. I hope you enjoy! Alright, let's first have a look at the review. So this is chess.com's algorithm. I played, look, not so well. Okay, I suppose, 78% accuracy. A mix of some good moves, but also some inaccurate moves and some mistakes as well. We start off, fairly even, and then through a series of moves, and these were the mistakes, I substantially worsened my position. And yet somehow from a completely losing position, I managed to get my own back for a win. Let's now have a look at the analysis. All right, so I played black in this game, an opponent white, and the opponent played the Queen's Gambit. So d4, d5, c4. Now, against the Queen's Gambit, my usual approach is to play the Slav defense, so c6, and we basically play the opening, developing the knights, and myself developing bishop f5. At this point, the opponent and I sort of break from sort of our opening theory. They develop bishop g5. Here, I wasn't entirely sure what was the best move, so I thought I would break open the tension. And that was okay, but it would have been better for me to develop the knight, providing an extra defender to the knight on f6. The opponent captures my knight, I capture back with my pawn, the g pawn, and Stockfish thinks that it would have been better in this case to capture back with the e pawn. But I thought that maybe I would have good opportunities by opening up the g file for my rook. Opponent now plays e4, which is a good move. I pull my bishop back to g6, moving it out of the way of the attack. Opponent now captures that hanging pawn with the development of their second bishop. I play e6. Opponent short castles. I develop my knight to d7. Opponent centers their rook to e1, and I think that opponent is actually playing pretty well overall from sort of the perspective of good opening principles, though we are completely equal at this point. Now, I had a number of ideas here. I thought that potentially, I could bring my rook to the g file, given the opponent has now short castle to place some pressure on the opponent on the opposite king. That with the dark square bishop and the queen, there was a potential attack on this diagonal, and also if we're going to make that attack work, we need to do something about that knight on f3. And I thought that maybe I had something here by putting my light square bishop on h5. Firstly, that would put pressure on that knight, but also pin it to the queen. Anyway, those are some of the ideas, and as it turns out, none of those ideas really worked out in the game. But let's go. Let's see. So firstly, I played bishop to h5. Opponent pulls their light square bishop back to e2, which was a very good move, provides an extra defender to that knight. And pretty much at this point, this whole idea doesn't really work, which makes this long diagonal idea not really work either. Nonetheless, I persisted, brought my rook to the g file, but all this is contingent on some of the defense here not being there. So I think this is why Stockfish didn't think that these were particularly promising moves. The opponent plays h3. And at this point, I sort of recognized that this attack didn't have much wind behind it, and I was worried about the potential for development of g4, which would attack my bishop, and my bishop doesn't really have very good places to go. So at this point, I thought it would be better for me to bring my bishop back, and I did so, bishop to g6. Opponent now pushes their center pawns, trying to crack open the center. Again, really no, pushing forward their advantage. I captured with a pawn. They captured back. I thought I had a very clever idea, bringing the queen to b6 with a potential attack on their pawn on b2, and also protecting these two squares, the d6 and also the pawn on e6, which is where their d pawn potentially could go. Again, this was a terrible idea, as it turns out, and you will see the evaluation really goes towards basically winning for the opponent. And the reason why this doesn't work becomes apparent. You know, they capture, and basically I've let them open up the center, and my king is still in the center of the board, and this is not good. This is not good. I should have captured back with the pawn on f7, but because I already had this this plan of this sort of maneuver, I ended up, without thinking too hard, capturing back with my queen, and this was a bad idea because now there is a discovered attack with that rook if the bishop moves out of the way, and the opponent immediately capitalizes on that. To be perfectly honest, at this point, I was so sort of blinded, I suppose, with my maneuvers. I didn't really even see the discovered attack. All I could see was this highly problematic double attack on my knight, which comes with check. And so I thought, look, probably the only good way of sorting that out is to long castles, brings my rook into the defense of that knight, and also potentially takes my king out of the center. That actually ended up being the best move, notwithstanding that the queen is hanging. But I think from Stockfish's perspective, that queen was lost anyway to a trade. So opponent trades rook for queen, very good trade. I am basically losing in this position as we move into the middle game. But, you know, and I at this point, I knew I was losing. But, you know, never give up, never surrender. I decided to play on. Opponent moves queen to the c file, to c1. Obviously now with a potential discovered check on my king, I slide the king out of the way to b8. Bishop captures knight. So, you know, trying to liquidate my pieces, which is a very good idea for the opponent. Though at the same time, I felt that, you know, if I played well or the opponent blunders, you know, I still had some possibilities. You know, I still had both rooks and I still had the bishop pair. Knights can definitely be tricky, but, you know, at the same time, they don't necessarily have some of the advantages of the bishops, especially as a board starts to clear up. The opponent brings their knight to h4 with a sort of simple attack on the bishop. Now, I didn't want to lose any more pieces here, so I bring my bishop back to f7. Opponent moves their queen to c2, so potential now attack on the pawn on h7, which of course would sort of come with also an attack on the rook. I can block that attack with the pawn by blocking the diagonal. Opponent brings their rook into the game, though potentially maybe not the best way, but there is a potential battery here, so I can certainly see the logic here. This gives me an opportunity, however, to pin that knight. Though, you know, yeah. So anyway, I thought that was the best move that I had. No, Stockfish sort of agrees. The opponent's advantage is starting to eke away a little bit. Opponent pushes their pawn to g4 with now another attack on my pawn on f5. I thought that this was probably a mistake, and Stockfish agrees, simply because that pawn cannot actually capture my pawn, given that it is in fact pinned. And now this potentially gives me some opportunities for some counterplay. So I capture, which I was glad to be able to do. Opponent captures my pawn on h7. However, I now have a discovered check. And this forces the opponent to move their king off the back rank, and so no longer potentially protected by some of these pieces at the back. And I saw that they were now on a dark square, and that dark diagonal is potentially there. And I thought that, maybe, possibly, could it be possible that there'll be some trap somewhere there? Now, one of the things when there are sort of the bishop pair and you've got rooks around and the queen all the way deep into the territory without many other supporting pieces is that you can quite effectively harass the queen. So that's what I did. So rook to g7, forcing the opponent to have to move their queen somewhere. They moved it to h8. And here I was wondering, is it possible? Could I trap their queen? And I saw a very sneaky move on the assumption that the opponent didn't see that check threat previously. I played c8. So now there is a potential discovered attack on their queen, just like, like this, just like what they did to me before. And with a bishop move, with check, a very, very forcing attack. And I was just hoping that the opponent didn't see this potential attack. Now, the opponent does have some fairly easy ways to get out of this. Firstly, they could just move their king out of the way. So they could just straight up capture that pawn, which moves it off that diagonal. They could move the king in the other direction, or the best move, which is to advance their pawn to f4, again, blocking that diagonal. However, after a reasonably long think, and that was almost, how long was that? It must be about 4 minutes, the opponent made a interesting knight move. So presumably they couldn't quite see how they could move their queen out of the way, or they thought that they were in a winning position. There's no obvious place that they can, in fact, move their queen. So obviously, all these squares are potentially problematic, and they didn't see that threat. So bishop to d6, check, discovered attack. Opponent, captures the pawn, which is probably the only thing they could reasonably do. I capture now the queen. I am now in a completely winning position. So both rooks, bishop pair versus rook with two knights. We have same number of pawns, and I was very, very happy now. I felt very comfortable that I was going to win. Opponent plays another knight move. I think almost I think they were just flustered. Obviously that gives in to a simple bishop capture with no, and white gets no compensation from that. They make one further move, with their rook, but then immediately resigned after that move. So I think recognizing that they had lost the game. Fantastic battle with my Canadian opponent. Good game. GG. My earlier blunder should have resulted in a loss for me. The insight from that part of the game, as I reflected on the moves, was that I was overly committed to an idea that I had in my head, not a very good idea, and as such ended up ignoring some basic principles, such as undoubling my pawns when I had the opportunity and not opening up the center when my king hasn't yet to castle. Although I don't know for sure, I suspect my opponent was overly committed to the idea that they were winning to recognize the trap. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.